My lady, I am your man. Some call it crazy, but they don't understand. When I'm home, baby, I'm always going to.
Good morning, guys. Of course, today I'm at a swim meet, and so I'm going to essentially do with you exactly what my B-Day peeps will be doing on Friday, and that is we're going to finish up Gilded Age time period by looking at the topic of Gilded Age politics. So you're required to take good notes, as this will be the last unit that we will cover that will be on next week's exam. That'll be on next week's exam. So you want to make sure that if you have any questions, if you develop any questions, you can submit those questions to me tomorrow morning, Friday morning, or via Periscope for our Periscope review sessions that we are going to have on Sunday at 8 p.m. So, Gilded Age politics. So we look at what the Gilded Age is and all the different components of the Gilded Age. So we are going to focus on the issue of politics, okay? And more specifically, the issue of political corruption. Now, this populist movement, that's the 1890s. We are going to take a quiz over that after our exam next week. So we will address this topic on a later day next week. So, but we're going to analyze the issue of the political system, American politics during the post-Civil War period. And so what is the Gilded Age? The Gilded Age is a time period in American history that was marked by rampant greed, corruption, exploitation, and inequality in American society, business, and in government. In 1879, young college student Woodrow Wilson, future President Woodrow Wilson, described the state of the American political system as, quote, having no parties, no leaders, no principles, and no parties. And one of Wilson's contemporaries, Henry Adams, agreed with Woodrow Wilson that the period was poor in purpose and barren in results. So politics during the political system during the Gilded Age was corrupted. The same level of corruption that we had in the business world and throughout society, in the big cities, we will see in politics as well. So during the Gilded Age, national issues, for the most part, the political parties practiced a policy of evading the big, major, divisive issues of the day. And so it was, if you look at bullet number 2, this is important for you to know, only on the tariff were there clear-cut divisions between the two parties, between Republicans who wanted to keep the tariff high and Democrats who preferred to keep the tariff low. But even there were exceptions at that. So remember, the rule of thumb is that when it comes to tariffs, industrialists, they like the tariffs high. Farmers like to keep tariffs low. And so on questions of the currency, regulation of big business, farm problems, civil service reform, which we will address later. So if you don't know what civil service reform means, it's okay. We're going to get to that at a future slide here down the road. Civil service reform, internal improvements, and immigration. The political parties differed very little. So one of the basic way we characterize Gilded Age politics is that the two major political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, really did not engage each other. With the exception of the tariff, they really didn't engage each other. In fact, on most political issues, they were in agreement. And so this is dangerous. If you look at bullet number 2, the two political parties, did consist of vast coalitions, so both Republicans and Democrats. Those parties were made up of vast, different groups of people. But, according to James Madison in Federalist number 10, he argued that no one group, no one region, no one idea, no one interest could hope to constitute a majority. And so he believed that one of the greatest threats to liberty, and of course, remember what our founding fathers were really leery of. They were leery of tyranny. Okay. They were leery. Madison basically says here that even though the Constitution doesn't call for a two-party system, the two-party system is very important because it provides, one of those checks and balances. It prevents any one group, any one idea, any one region, or any one interest from amassing a lot of power. And so basically one reason why the Gilded Age political system was broken is that we did not have a healthy two-party system. The two-party system in the United States is bent towards, they help keep each other in check. If we ever have a day in which the two political parties are identical, then liberty is threatened, and that would pave the way towards that would pave the way, putting the United States on the road to tyranny. So it says any party with an expectation of governing ultimately had to include a variety of groups, interests, and ideas. Okay, so like I said before, the bottom line is the American political system is bent towards a two-party system, and Gilded Age politics featured an American political system where there were very few differences between the parties, and this, according to Madison, threatened liberty. Why? Why were they similar? Number one, what happened the last time the two political parties took clear-cut stands on deeply moral issues? If you guessed Civil War, you are correct. We had very bloody consequences as a result. The last time the political parties really engaged each other in battle, was the Civil War. And so after the Civil War, during the Gilded Age, politicians were not likely to really engage each other out of fear that it would lead to partisanship, and that partisanship would lead to sectionalism, and that sectionalism would lead to ultimate conflict in other ways. So it's a big reason why they didn't engage each other, because of this Civil War. And number two, another reason why very little gets done politically by the government during the Gilded Age is that the two political parties were evenly divided. So, for example, with the exception of Grover Cleveland, okay, the Republicans will dominate the White House. From 1869 to 1913, the party of Abraham Lincoln will win every presidential campaign, with the exception of Grover Cleveland. Now, interesting thing about Grover Cleveland is that Cleveland was probably more Republican than he was Democrat. So the Republicans came out of the Civil War, and this I do want you to know, the Republicans came out of the Civil War the winners, right? I mean, if the Civil War was anything, it was a war between Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other. And so when the war was over, Republicans, when they campaigned for national office, they engaged in a campaign tactic, and this is what you need to know. They engaged in a campaign tactic called waving the bloody shirt. Waving the bloody shirt. What was waving the bloody shirt about? Essentially, the Republicans, every election cycle, reminded the American voters that the Democrats had essentially initiated a civil war. It's basically reminding the American people that the Democratic Party is the party of secession and is the party, and of course, you know, John Wilkes Booth was a Democrat, and, you know, so basically reminding, you know, what happened the last time the Democrats had any power whatsoever. And we had a civil war. And so that's a big reason why Republicans were able to dominate the White House. Bullet number 2, between 1872 and 1896, no president won a majority of the popular vote. And so we talk about why was it difficult to get for the political system to yield any results. And it's because there was. I mean, we were literally a 50-50 country, really sharply divided politically. In 1888, Benjamin Harrison couldn't even achieve plurality over Cleveland. The Republicans generally controlled the Senate, and during the Gilded Age, the Democrats generally controlled the House. So anytime you had a Republican president, the Democrats would control Congress. And anytime we had a Democrat president, the Republicans would control Congress. And so what that means, gang, is that we've got gridlock. The Gilded Age political system, I guess one word you could use to describe it is gridlock. There's a lot of gridlock because, as you can see here, most bills require bipartisan support in order to pass. And during the Gilded Age, legislators tended to vote along party lines, which made it very difficult to get legislation passed. So very good. Also, another characteristic of the Gilded Age political system is that no president between Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt would you be able to describe as being a strong president. And so the presidents of the Gilded Age are often the ones that very few Americans even know. I mean, we've got, you know, obviously Ulysses S. Grant. I think everybody knows Ulysses S. Grant, the former war hero. But after Grant, you know, we have Rutherford B. Hayes, right? We're going to have Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland, Chester Arthur, you know. So these are, you know, these are presidents that are quite well unknown, and it's because they weren't very strong when it comes to leadership. And you see bullet number 1, that none of them seriously challenged the prevailing view that the formulation of policy belonged to Congress. So during the Gilded Age, the president pretty much allowed the Congress to run the government. They saw the function of the presidency as just simply administering the government, you know, signing bills, signing paychecks, things like that, making appointments. The ideal presidential candidate during the Gilded Age displayed an affable personality, a willingness to cooperate with the bosses, an ability to win votes from various factions, resided in pivotal states, boasted a good war record. He had no views that might alienate powerful voting blocs and few or no political enemies. So presidential candidates during the Gilded Age, presidents were not men who sought to rock the boat. And the American people did not elect politicians who sought to rock the boat by taking like really clear-cut stands on really controversial issues. Plus, if you look at every president from Ulysses S. Grant all the way to William McKinley, who William McKinley was elected in 1896 and was assassinated in 1901, every single one of these presidents were Union Army. And so one of the most powerful special interest groups in the United States during the Gilded Age that wielded considerable political power was an organization called, and you need to know this group, it was called the GAR. GAR stands for the Grand Army of the Republic. And the Grand Army of the Republic was an organization of Union veterans, and they funded political campaigns. They were, in order to be elected president of the United States, getting the endorsement of the GAR was absolutely pivotal. Now, vice presidential candidates during the Gilded Age were chosen oftentimes to balance the ticket, to improve the party's chances in a key state, or to placate a disappointed faction. So with very little getting done in Washington, what did the parties do? How did they spend their time? And so ultimately, this is where the corruption comes in. The parties became machines for seeking office, dispensing patronage in the form of government jobs and contracts. So we want to understand what do we mean by patronage? By the way, patronage is you need to know patronage. It's very important. Okay, patronage is the most common form of government corruption at all levels of government, local, state, and federal levels. Patronage is the practice of giving political supporters government jobs. Okay. And then once these office holders get their jobs, then they use their positions of power in order to make themselves rich. And that's what graft is. Graft is essentially the practice of doing political favors in exchange for kickbacks. And oftentimes the kickbacks was money. Okay. So graft is using your political power to do, favors, to do favors in exchange for kickbacks, for cash and such. So during the Gilded Age, there was an alliance between big business and politicians. This alliance wasn't necessarily corrupt, since many politicians ultimately favored the interests of business anyway. And really the American public wasn't outraged by the high level of corruption, the patronage, and graft. They were not outraged yet by the alliance between big business and the politicians. In the industrialization unit, we looked at, for example, the corrupt alliance between the politicians and the robber barons and the railroad tycoons. And so ultimately, that's also another characteristic of the Gilded Age political system. So the odd thing to me, the ironic thing is that in a period of time in which the government wasn't accomplishing anything, they weren't passing legislation, they weren't using governmental power to address important political problems and issues, like an unregulated economy. You got all these social injustices going on throughout the period. You would think that voters would be very apathetic. Today, when we hold elections, let's take presidential elections. When we have a presidential election, we are lucky if 40% of the voters turn out to vote. 40%, over half of the voters in this country don't even vote for president. They're eligible to vote, they're old enough to vote, but they don't vote. And the Gilded Age had amongst the highest voter turnout in history, which is weird because the Gilded Age is arguably the most corrupt period in American history when it comes to corruption in government. But yet, the American people were not apathetic. They weren't angry about it. They weren't frustrated by it. In fact, they voted, and they kept reelecting these people. They kept reelecting these corrupted politicians at all levels of government. You know, whenever these politicians would come home, they would have political rallies, parades, and picnics. And man, the people would come out in huge numbers to cheer on their congressmen or their senators or their state legislators or whatever, you know? So it's really weird, you know? So ultimately, you know, to answer the question as to why, one theory is that the American people believed that work was getting done. And so ultimately, that is a good reason why. So, tell you what, I'm going to go get my dogs, and I'm going to go quiet them down a little bit. Hold on a second. Come on, let's go outside. Let's go get him. Come on. Come. Now. Come. Come. Okay, guys, I'm sorry about that. My dogs are going crazy. Crazy, crazy, crazy. All right. So a big accomplishment that we have, this is a note card term. I want to explain it real quick, is the 1883 Pendleton Civil Service Act, okay? So the civil service reform is the, essentially was this aim to try to eliminate patronage, okay? The giving away of government jobs to political supporters. It was designed to replace the patronage system with a civil service system. So in other words, government jobs will be based on merit rather than, you know, connections and who you know. And so President James Garfield is elected. Okay. I'm going to go back. So President Garfield is elected president. He is a reformer. He's one of the first presidents of the Gilded Age to actually attempt to reform this corrupt political system. Okay. And so he initiated this law, and he pushed this law through, and ultimately, before the law could take effect, Garfield is actually going to be assassinated. Less than a year into his presidency, a disgruntled office seeker, a gentleman who had written many letters to President Garfield at wanting a government job. Will shoot Garfield. Garfield will essentially be bedridden for a number of months and ultimately will succumb. Assassinated. His vice president was Chester A. Arthur from New York. And Arthur was not like Garfield. Garfield was, again, remember, Garfield was a reformer. And one of our note card terms is mugwump. He was a mugwump. And a mugwump is defined as a reform-minded Republican, a Republican who was a big believer in reforming the political system. Arthur was a stalwart. And a stalwart is a term that historians use to describe politicians in both parties who supported the status quo, who supported patronage. In fact, when Charles Guiteau is the individual who assassinated James Garfield, after he shot Garfield, he said, "I am a stalwart. Now Arthur is president." And so perhaps one of Chester Arthur's greatest is, despite the fact that he was not a reformer, despite the fact that he was not a mugwump and he was a stalwart, he went ahead and signed the Pendleton Civil Service Act into law anyway. And so that's cool. That's cool. So that's when it comes to Chester A. Arthur, that you need to know that about him. You need to know that about him. So as I mentioned before, I knew this slide was here. How is it then that the leaders who failed to face up to the real issues presided over the most highly organized and politically energized electorate in American history? And the answer is that the politicians and the voters deeply believed that they were dealing with critical issues such as the tariff and monopolies. And of course, we all know about the monopolies, the whole Sherman Antitrust Act, right? The Interstate Commerce Commission, currency reform, civil service reform, and immigration reform. The fact is they were passing bills, but the bills were symbolic, only in name only. So historians try to figure out what motivated party loyalty during the Gilded Age. And what historians find is that people voted not with their pocketbook. Normally political scientists believe, they do all these studies, what motivates political behavior. And political behavior is largely rooted in pocketbook issues. When people vote with their pocketbook. Economics, which party, which candidate is best going to benefit me economically. Pocketbook voters are what we call them. But during the Gilded Age, this is called the new political history, is that during the Gilded Age, people didn't vote with their pocketbook. They voted with their ethnic prejudices, their cultural heritage, and their religious convictions. They became social voters. And according to one of the new political historians, he says, "It has become clear to us that the energy shaping public life are emotional as well as rational and cultural as well as economic." So the big term, of course, is emotional and cultural. These are cultural voters. Okay. Woodrow Wilson said of the parties before the turn of the century, he said, quote, "Far from being like two empty bottles that differed only by their labels, each party contained a mixture of ingredients picked up in the course of U.S. history." So let's look at the two political parties. And what were they? What did they look like? First, we've got the Republicans. Actually, it is during the Gilded Age in which political cartoonist Thomas Nast is going to create mascots for the two political parties. And by the way, these mascots were not designed to be, respectful. You got the elephant with the Republicans, the grand old party, the GOP, the Republicans. They were they're your former Whigs, right? They're from that old former Whig tradition. Republicans in the Gilded Age attracted political insiders, reformers. The members of the Republican Party were mainly Protestants of British descent, or they were established American stock. These are families that have been in the country for many generations. The native seat, the home, the hub of the Republican Party was in New England. Its strongholds were New York and the upper Midwest. They saw themselves as the legitimate heirs of the abolition tradition. So these are your old abolitionists, right? Your moralists, your religious types, the spiritual descendants of the perfectionists who populated the rivals the Second Great Awakening and the reform movements of the antebellum period. They tended to be anti-Catholic. Remember, they're the old Know-Nothing tradition. Remember the Know-Nothing Party? It was an anti-Catholic party. Another loyal voting group during the Gilded Age were African Americans, Union veterans of the Civil War, and Protestant immigrants. Protestant immigrants tended to vote Republican. So what about the Democrats? They tended to be outsiders. They tended to be heterogeneous, made up of many different groups. And it often has been described, the Democrats in the Gilded Age, as a coalition of unlikely allies. What do you mean by unlikely allies? I mean, you've got, in one hand, you got Southern whites who practice Jim Crow segregation, right? And they're in the same party as immigrants. And so it's an unruly coalition of unlikely allies. It was basically an immigrant party in the North, made up of Catholics, Jews, free thinkers, skeptics. You know, skeptics are people who kind of they didn't like the Republicans because they saw the Republicans as the party of morality, that the Republicans kind of put themselves on a little bit of a pedestal, holier than thou, do as I say, not as I do. A Chicago Democrat explained, quote, "A Republican is a man who wants you to go to church every Sunday, and a Democrat says if he wants to have a glass of beer on Sunday, he can have it." You know, so Democrats were the party of personal liberty, and Democrat conventions tend to be more disorderly than Republican gatherings. Republicans tend to be a little bit more organized. Oh, and the mascot is the donkey. Donkey. So, serious issues of monetary and agrarian reform, labor, race, economic fairness were largely swept under the rug during this period. So, during the Gilded Age, these politicians in both parties had serious issues that the country was facing. They were just simply ignoring them. And it wasn't until 1893, when the country plunges into a depression, that the two political parties will face a third-party challenge. And that party is called the Populist Party. And we will address that in a separate unit. Okay, so the post-Civil War era was generally one of disillusionment. Politicians were surrounded by scandal and corruption. You know, for example, believe it or not, the president of the United States after the Civil War, during the Gilded Age, who was just surrounded with, linked to scandal after scandal after scandal, was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant wasn't necessarily corrupt. It's just that men in his administration were corrupt. You had, what was called the whiskey ring. You had the Credit Mobilier scandal with the Transcontinental Railroad. But yeah, I mean, politicians were surrounded by scandal, and of course, at a time in which we actually had problems facing industrial America, that were festering underneath the surface. The Gilded Age was monopolized by two patronage-fattened political parties, which, for the most part, competed for loot, for spoils, for government dollars, while essentially agreeing on most national issues. And cultural differences, different constituencies, is what yielded unprecedented voter turnout. So we talked about graft already. We talked about patronage, and patronage ultimately will lead to that civil service reform initiated by Garfield, signed into law by Arthur. And remember these terms, these are all note card terms. These are terms used to describe politicians in the Gilded Age. Mugwumps were reform-minded Republicans. These are politicians who wanted to reform the political system. Stalwarts, these are your corrupt. Another term we use are called the old guard. They want to maintain the status quo. They have no problem with patronage. They have no problem with graft. And the half-breeds were politicians that you found in both political parties that were ultimately corrupt but supported civil service reform. Okay, So that is the Gilded Age Politics unit. So make sure that just know that our exam over the Gilded Age is on Monday. So make sure you're putting that time in now because it is a considerable amount of content. Go through your DQs. Go through your DQs. Make sure you've got a good set of DQs to study from. Start knocking those out. Drill and kill those note cards. And questions, the better. I'm telling you, the sooner the better. Okay, I will be in the morning, Friday morning, and I will have a Periscope on Sunday at 8 o'clock. So, hope you have a good day, and thanks.